Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Kuf Dalid. We'll back up a little bit. I know we covered the Mishnah on Kuf Gimel and Mabet, but since that Mishnah will serve as the core text that we will be analyzing, we'll back up a little bit and go over that Mishnah together. So we're on again Kuf Gimel on Mabet 103b, and we are at the Mishnah. So we're dealing with the sale of real property, and I tell you, base core afarani mocher loch. I'm going to sell you a base core 30 sub, I think that produces 30 sub worth of production. I'm going to sell that amount of, or the amount of seeds that could, that are 30 sub, can be planted there. That's the space that it includes. Mida b'chevel, and I say that it's going to be measured by rope. Essentially, what I'm saying is that is a very precise measurement. I'm not. It's not too much, not too little. Pichas kol shehu. If I sell you anything less than that, yanaka, I have to make it less expensive for you. Hotir kol shehu. If I make it anything extra, if I charge even if I give you anything extra, yakser, you, the buyer, will need to return it. Now, there are a couple of important Rashbams here. Rashbam, let's take a look. Because kol shehu shelo haya beoso sadeh base core shalem. That if I don't actually give you a full base core, yinaka hamocher kefi hapachas v'hamecha kayam, that we say that this transaction is a full-fledged enforced transaction, but the seller needs to take off some of the price because I didn't give you the full amount that I said I was going to. Now, here is the key question that both Tosos and Rashbam deal with. We saw a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago to be exact, that in Parak Hamoker as a Svina, that in the chapter Hamoker as a Svina, which was again what was that? That's the fifth chapter of Bava Basra. So we said in that chapter, Kol Davar Shebemida, that anytime you sell something that is capable of measurement, Vishabimishkal, or weighing, Uvishabiminyan, or numbering. So I either sell you a dozen eggs, or I sell you a piece of material that I say is 1 foot by 1 foot, or I sell you exactly a pound of cheese. If I do any of those things, afilu pachos mikidei ona, even if the difference is less than ona, meaning in general, I'm not allowed to overcharge you by a sixth. So if let's say I only give you 11 eggs, or I give you 0.9 pounds, or I give you 11 and a half inches squared as opposed to a foot squared. So then in all those cases, choser, the transaction gets undone. Umukak hasam demekak taosu havi. And the implication there was that it is a mistaken transaction. So the question that's implicit in those words in the Rashbam is, why don't we say that here? Here, instead of saying that we're going to undo the transaction and it's a mekach tos, we say instead that no, it's a good transaction, and I just have to charge you a little bit less because I gave you a little bit less. And we'll see the next words in the Mishnah are, if I give you a little bit extra, I can charge you a little bit extra. So what's the difference? So hani mili b'metaltalin. So according to the Rashbam, when Rava made his statement about Mida, Mishkal, and Minyan, it was only in movable objects, not immovable objects, not in particular real estate. So we are in the middle of the Rashbam, Pichas Kolshu, second Rashbam on the Mishnah on Kuf Gimel Amabet. We're going back just a little bit to review the Mishnah because it's going to be the central piece of the discussion today. And we're now asking the following question. The Mishnah opens by saying that if I tell you I'm selling you a certain amount of land measured by rope, and then I give you a little less or I give you a little extra, in both cases, the transaction's a valid transaction, and we simply use a little bit of money to make up the difference. But we saw a couple of weeks ago, back on Daf Tzaddik Amud Aleph, that Rava says that when you have something that's measured or weighed or measured in physical dimension, or weighed, or counted, then if you are missing any, it's an invalid, mistaken transaction, and we return everything, and it's as if the transaction never happened. So how come we are reaching a different conclusion here? And Rashbam says it's because we're dealing with movable objects. Aval bekarka. Again, the third line beneath the Mishnah, right underneath where it says Mishnah in the Rashbam. Aval bekarka lo shayach b'hu chazara. But when it comes to land, that we won't apply this concept of returning, of undoing the transaction. Dekim lehu l'rabanan, denicha lehu lokeach, liknos masha yimsa lefi amida, hein cheser, hein yeser. The point is that we understand, the rabbis recognize that most buyers in these kind of situations are willing to take a little bit more or a little bit less. Umocher nami hachi, kamarlai base core, farani mocher lecha, lefi midas hachebel. And the seller specifically said the amount that he was selling. V'im yechaser anake, v'im yoter taxer li. Meaning, and the point is that it's an implied element of the transaction. And even though we generally say that there's no ona for karka, meaning that if in general, if I charge you a sixth more than the market price for something, so then it's a valid transaction and I have to give you the money back. And if I charge you more than a sixth more on something, then not only it's a totally invalid transaction, hani mili, when we say that but when it comes to land, we don't say that. We say that basically, according to the Rashbam, whatever the price is, even if I charged you, 100% more, it's a valid transaction. Hani mili kishayim korlo biyoker yoter mishtus. That's where I sell it more expensively. Aval hecha demat'ain ze et ze b'mida. But where I make a mistake with respect to the measurement, sarach lanakos min adamim. Well, then I have to reduce the amount of money that I owe you. So that is the Rashbam's approach. Now,
but didn't we say here? I'm sorry, didn't we read just now in the Rashbam that people in land transaction are willing to forgive a few cents either way?
Yes, oh, absolutely. So thank you for highlighting that. Effectively, the Rashbam has asked two questions. Question number one is, how can we have that this is a valid transaction when it comes to saying, and the questions go in opposite directions. So the first question is, how can this be a valid transaction when we saw that if you're off by a little bit when it comes to measurement or counting or weighing, well, then it's a totally invalid transaction. It's a mekaktos. So the answer to that is that it's only a mekaktos when it comes to metaltlin, according to the Rashbam. But then the Rashbam turns around and asks the question in the other direction, which is, why should the person have to return anything? Meaning, don't we have this concept of ein ona b'karka, so I can overcharge you however much I want? So why should there be any kind of return? And the Rashbam answers that question by saying, yes, if I just simply charge you, if I don't give you any measurements and don't tell you any details about the field, then absolutely I can overcharge you however much I want, and however much you're willing to pay. However, when it comes to my telling you something, then if I tell you something that's false, well, then we have to fix it. And so as a result, if I tell you that I'm measuring a very precise amount, a base core, I believe, is 75,000 square amos. and I tell you that's exactly how much I'm selling you, well, then if it is anything less than that, even if it's 1 square amma less than that, then I have to give you a reduced price because you're not paying. So even though, if we just looked at the land and I said, I'm selling you this land for this amount of price, I could charge you whatever. When it comes to this, if the measurement is wrong, I have to give you a discount. Okay. So that is that's the Rashbam's back and forth. Now let's turn.
I just two quick questions here. One is I got the impression that this fellow comes with a rope. He measures it exactly. So where's the discussion then? He says, we know that I'm coming with my rope. I've measured this and this is what I'm buying. So how is there even any discussion if he comes and measures it from a priori?
Well, you're assuming that. And let's take a look at Tosfos, because Tosfos is going to answer that question. If we take a look at the top Tosfos, Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph, we're going to skip down to the actual answer that Tosfos gives, the Re gives. So it's the last word or last abbreviation on the first narrow line in Tosfos on Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph, and Pachos Kol Shehu Yanaka is the name of the Tosfos, is the different Moscow. So, V'omari, de Rava Iri Kishimudadu. V'hitau b'mida. So, and by the way, I will note that the Tosfos has a big problem with the Rashbam's answer, because the implication of the Gemara elsewhere is that, in fact, this concept that if there's a problem in the measurement, it also undoes the transaction. That is also applicable by land. So you can't just say that we're talking that Rava's statement is by metaltalin. So the Re says, no, we have to say that what we're talking about is the difference is if in the case of Rava, he measured it or says that he measured it ahead of time. And so as a result, if there's anything off, it's going to be an undone transaction. Aval haka, and this is touching on the topic that you just raised, Ken. Loma to do adayin. They never measured it yet. Ela biva in limdod. They were coming to measure. Umitchila hayanami yodea she'enu mechavin kol kach. Shelo yehe o pachos o yoser. And so as a result, because they never measured, I say to you, let's go to my field, Ken. I'm going to sell you a base core, and we're going to measure it. And then we get to the field, and it turns out that it's a little bit less or a little bit more. Well, then we all understood that the measurement had not yet happened, and we were going to do that measurement together so that everybody agrees to the measurement. And now we agreed to the measurement, and guess what? It's a little bit less. So as a result, I have to charge you a little bit less. I can't apply Ona, and I also won't apply Rava's statement because we knew going in that it had not yet been measured. So that is the answer, and that addresses your first question. So you had the second question?
Yeah, the second question I have, does Rava, how would Rava hold here with the metaltalin? There would be a mechektos, right? But with karka there isn't, and you deduct it. Maybe it's a minor point, but we earlier in the Gemara we equated karka with avadim. How would Rava hold regarding avadim here? If this was a transaction regarding avadim, would he give him? The transaction go through, but he would pay less for the avadim?
That's an excellent question. I would think that I can't be 100% sure, but I would think that in this particular instance, avadim, if you're talking about some kind of count of the avadim, and I say that I'm selling you 7 and I only give you 6, I'm not sure that would be a valid transaction. So I think that although often we say slaves are treated like karka, I'm not sure whether Rava's and again, remember that only the Rashbam views the answer to the question of how we understand Rava by limiting Rava to metaltalin. Tosfos's answer is intentionally omitting any reference to karka or metaltalin, because he would apply Rava even by karka. So according to Tosfos, of course, if I made a mistake with respect to the measurement and the number of slaves that I was selling you, we would say that I have it's a mekach tos. So Tosfos, it would be an easy answer. It's a little more complicated according to the Rashbam, but my guess is that they would agree that it would be a mekach tos because although we say that slaves are like land, in this particular instance, I would imagine that it's not. I don't know that I'm not sure, but I seem to recall that we would not necessarily, when we say Eino Nab B'karka, I'm not sure that we say that by slaves. It will depend on the reasoning of Eino Nab B'karka. One of the reasons that we say Eino Nab B'karka is because every piece of land is unique. And if you were to say that, well, then maybe the same thing would apply by a slave because every slave is unique. But in any event, it's an interesting question. I don't have the definitive answer for you. But okay, let's go back and we're going to read the Mishnah again from the beginning. Now we've got the basic idea. Understand that this concept of Ona is not going to be relevant here for whatever the reason, and we're not going to apply Rava's rule either in this situation. So again, for either the reason that the Rashbam says or the reason that Tosfos offers. But again, base core for ani mocher lach. I'm selling you a base core, mida bechevel, that's measured by rope, meaning that I'm selling you a precise amount. Pichas kosher, if I sell you anything less, yanaka, I've got to give you a discount. Hoser kosher yakser. And if I sell and give you anything extra, it has to be returned. We're going to see what that means, whether it means that you have to return the money or the property. So ve'im amar, and if the person says, hein chaser, hein yaser, I'm going to sell you about a base core, whether maybe a little more, a little less. Well, then afilu pichas rov l'sa. Well, then as long as the quarter cub per saw that I sell less than a base core, then that is going to be permitted. Meaning there are 6 kavs in a saw. A quarter kav, of course, is a fourth. So that's 1/24. So the simplest read of this Mishnah is that I can sell you, 4%, roughly 4% less than the actual amount of land that I say, and that's still okay. Or if I give you an extra 4%, that's still okay. Afilu pichas rov of l'sa, ohoser rov l'sa higio. It's a valid transaction as long as the difference is not that much. Yoser mikan. But if the difference is larger than that amount, yaseh cheshbon. Well, then we got to do some math. Mahu machzerlo. So what, and meaning that, and you're going to have to compensate me, or I'm going to have to compensate you. So mahu machzerlo, what does the person return? Meaning if I gave you too much or gave you too little, how do we deal with the difference? The difference is handled mos. It's with money, meaning that you'll just pay me extra if I gave you extra, if I gave you too much extra, and I will return money to you if you paid me too much because I didn't give you as much land as I promised. V'im ratza, however, if the seller wants machzer lo karka, well, then the buyer can say, then he can say to the buyer, listen, I want you to return land. V'lama amru machzer lo mos. Why did the rabbi say that you have to return money as the baseline? Liyapos koko shamocher, in order to give the seller a better position. She'im shir bisada base tisha kavin, because if there's left over 9 kav, meaning if the difference between what I gave you and what I was supposed to give you was 9 kav in a sadeh, or uvagina base chatzikav, or a half kav in a garden, and that's the same ratio. Ukadivrei Rabbi Akiva base rova, or according to Rabbi Akiva, the area of a quarter kav, maxer lo es akarka. Well, then you have to return the land, meaning that if I gave you enough that the amount, and Rashbam explains this in greater detail, but we don't have the time to go through it in detail, that if I give you enough, if I gave you too much, and the amount that I gave extra could in and of itself be a good field or a good garden, Well, then in that situation, the buyer has the right to just return the land, and he doesn't have to pay extra money for the difference. V'lo es harova bilvad hu machzer, and he doesn't just return the quarter kav per saw, ella es kol hamoser. He returns everything extra. So again, like we saw earlier, it's not just, and the Gemara is going to explain it this way. It's not just the original amount. It's not just the extra overage, meaning, right, if I had given you, again, especially in the second case where told you I was giving you the beit core of land more or less, so you would be able to just keep the quarter kav per saw of extra land. But if I ended up giving you more than a quarter kav per saw, let's say I gave you a half kav per saw, well, now you don't get to keep the amount that if I had given you originally, you would have been able to keep it all, namely the quarter kav, and just give me back the extra quarter kav, but rather you have to give me back the half kav per saw that I gave extra to you. And so as a result, now I'm going to get all of that land back, not just the overage that I have above the limit. And that's very similar to what we've seen before. Okay, so now the Gemara asks a very logical question, because our Mishnah addressed two separate situations. It addressed the explicit situation where I tell you I'm giving you a precise measurement, and the Mishnah shared the fact that if I tell you that I'm giving you land more or less, then it's as if I then if I'm a little bit off, then you get to keep it. So what is the question that the Gemara is going to ask now is Ibaylahu? They ask Beis Kor Stama Mai. What if I don't say either that I'm giving you a precise measurement, mida b'chavel, and I don't say hein yeser, hein chaser, hein yeser, and I don't say more or less. And so as a result, what's the halacha? Do we say that in fact I'm telling you a precise number, and so even if I've got a little bit extra, it's going to get returned? Or do I say that no, it's as if I said more or less, and therefore if I'm a little bit off, we're going to be fine and we'll just leave it as it is? So we're going to first start with an effort to prove it from our Mishnah. So Tashma, Beis Kor Afar Ani Moker Lach. I said in our Mishnah that if I'm selling you a Beis Kor, Mod Bechevel, that's measured by a rope, well then, as we turn to Kuf Daled Amud Aleph, Pachos Kol Shehu Yanaka, Yeser Kol Shehu Yakser. That if I gave you too little, I have to deduct from the purchase price, and if I gave you too much, then you have to return it. So hastama, what is the implication? The implication is that is only true if I say it explicitly. So as a result, if I don't say anything, if I just say I'm selling you a Beis Kor, then kahein chaser, hein yeser dummy. Well, then it would be comparable to my saying more or less. Ema Seifa, but then one second, if that were true, look at the end of our Mishnah, because we say V'im Amar Lo Hein Chaser Hein Yeser. So if I say a little more, a little less, or a little more, Afil Pikas Rova Sasa. Oh, Hoser Rova Lasa Higyu. Then it's a valid transaction, even if I gave you a 4% difference, it'll still be a valid transaction. So what is the implication? Hastama, if I don't say anything about it, well then, kamida v'chevel dummy. It should be comparable to my saying that it's as if I measured by a rope. So elamiha leika lamashma lamina. So as a result, we can't learn anything from our Mishnah. So let's take a look at a following brisa. So Tashma, we have a brisa. Beis Kor Afar Ani Mocher Lach. I tell you that I'm selling you a Beis Kor of dirt. So now again, here, this first comment is the one that's relevant, because that's where I don't tell you either. I don't say an approximate, and I don't say as measured. So, or if I say Beis Kor Afar Ani Mocher Lach, about a Beis Kor I'm selling you. Or if I say Hein Chaser Hein Yaser, ani mocher lach. Or if I tell you, well, I'm selling you less or more, well, then afilu pichas rova kslusa, even if I reduced it by a quarter kav per saw, less than a base core, hoser rova, or if I increased it that much, higio, it's a valid transaction. I was giving you an approximate. So what do we see? Because what was the first comment in this brisa? It was base core afar. It was a stam statement. It didn't have any approximations, and it didn't say mida b'chevel. So as a result, we see alma stama nami kehein chaser hein yeser dami. So we see that a simple statement is comparable to saying more or less, meaning a simple statement is confirming that it's going to be an approximate amount. No, maybe not. Maybe not. The Gemara responds. Hasam parushe kamafarish. Maybe not, that this is not three separate cases of base core, kives core, ein hein chaser hein yaser, but rather it's one case. And what is the case saying? Ezehu base core shehib kives core. What is the base core that I'm selling you? I'm selling you a kives core. And if I were to say, I'm selling you a base core that is like a base core, then it's like Kagon de Amar Le Hein Chaser Hein Yaser. Then it's like I'm telling you it's a little more or a little less. So Maskiv Lo Rav Ashi says that's a ridiculous read, because Im Kain ani mocher lach lamali. Why did the Mishnah, why did this brisa that we were quoting keep repeating I'm selling you, right? It said kibes kor afar ani mocher lach. Then it's saying I'm sorry, first it said base core afarani mocherlach, then it said kives core afarani mocherlach, and then it said hein chaser hein yaser ani mocherlach. So it seems very clear, as Rav Ashi is pointing out, that it's three separate transactions. Elalav shmamina stamanami kehein chaser hein yaser dami shmamina. So actually, you're absolutely right. Rav Ashi's question is a good question, and so as a result, we are going to say that this is a valid proof that if, in fact, I were to tell you that I'm still selling you an acre of land, if I don't say an acre of land as measured, well, then if it's a little bit more or a little bit less, then it's okay and it's a valid transaction, and we are not going to undo that transaction. So then we said, Mahu Maxer Lo, what does, if I give too much to you, what do you return to me? And we said that we return Maos, you return money. And we said, Liyapos Koko Shel Moker Amrinan. We said that it's in order to strengthen the hand of the seller. Liyapos Koko Shel Lokeach Lo Amrinan. But are you telling me we don't also try to improve the position of the buyer? Vahatanya, we have a brisa that seems to suggest that we try to improve both of their positions, meaning that we give the buyer certain rights. So, because listen to this brisa, Pichas shivas kabin umechza lechor. If I gave 7.5 calves less than the core that I was promised, that the person then I promised the buyer. So, and 7.5 calves is the ratio of quarter calf per saw, because again, a core is 30 saw. A quarter times 30 is a 7.5, and so that's how we have 7.5 calves for the core. So, hosir shivas kabin umechza lechor. Or if I gave you 7.5 kav too much, higio. It's a valid transaction because I have not exceeded the limit. Again, we're dealing with a situation where I did not say measured precisely. So that's why, if I'm a little bit off, we're going to say it's a valid transaction. Yoser mikan. But if I did more than that, if the difference was greater than that, kofen es hamocher limkor ve'es halokeach likach. We force the seller to sell and the buyer to buy. Whoa! Here we have that we're forcing the seller to do something. That implies that the buyer has certain rights, meaning it's not just that we're forcing the buyer to to purchase the extra land, it seems like that the buyer has the right that if the seller says, no, I want to get the land back, that he could say, no, I want you to sell me that extra land, and we will force the seller to sell it. So the buyer also seems to have some rights. So in the end, we're going to say that the buyer has rights, but it isn't that right. So Hassam could go into Hava.
To what extent do we kofin? In the other case, we say kofin or to ad sheyagid ani rotzeh, right?
No, yeah. This is a monetary situation. Again, we're not, when we say here kofin, it's how the Beis Din is going to rule. I don't think it's meaning that we're going to beat the guy with a stick until he does it. Of course, if he then doesn't listen to the Beis Din, maybe we will, but that's not different from any other situation. This kofin is not the kofin that we talk about when it comes to sending a divorce document. Okay, so and it does highlight the fact that the same word can be used in different contexts and have different meanings. Of course, this whole Masechet has been talking about, much of the Masechet has been talking about chazaka, and again, chazaka is one of those words that has different meanings in different contexts. So that, I think that's the case here. But in any event, the question is that we seem to have just said that we're forcing the seller to sell, meaning that the buyer has some rights. So Hassam could go to Havi Yakira Mikara Vizal Hashta. No, the situation is where the price was higher at the time of the sale, and now it's lower. So the question is which price, when we say that the seller can force the buyer to buy it, does the seller force the buyer to buy the land at the price that it was higher originally, because that was the original sale price, or do we say no? Now is the new sale, and we're going to only have the buyer pay the current market price. The amrinan lay. So we say to the seller, "I ara yahavle havle kizula dahashta." So what we end up saying to the seller is, yes, you seller get to decide whether you're going to get the overage back in the land or the overage back in money. But if you are choosing to sell it, well, then you have to give him the cheaper price. And so now we understand when we say that we're forcing the seller to sell and the buyer to buy, the buyer is being forced to choose by the seller to either give back land or to pay for the property in additional funds. But the seller is being forced that if he's going to sell it, he has to give the lower price that exists today and not the higher original price. 1 second though, Vatanya Kishahu no saying low. We have a brisa that says that when the seller gives the buyer the excess land, no saying low, Kashar shalakach mimenu, that the buyer has to give him the price at which the original purchase was made. So doesn't that contradict the read that you just gave to the other brisa? No, it does not contradict, because Hassam could go into Havazula Mikara V'Yakra Lahashta. That situation where we say that the seller has to give the buyer the original price, that's where the price has gone up. So the bottom line is that the seller decides whether the extra gets sold, but the buyer decides whether to use the original or the current price. So the buyer has the advantage on the price, and so that's why we say kofin es hamocher, and the seller has the advantage in being able to determine whether the overage gets purchased or the overage land gets returned. Okay, so now we get to the bottom. We're at the 2 dots, 4 lines up from the bottom of Kuf Dalet and Aleph. She'im shier besada base tet kaven. So we said that if in fact the amount of the overage was 9 kavs in the field, so then the buyer can return the excess land and cannot be forced to purchase it. Amar Rav Huna, tet kabin she'amru. When we say tet kabin, it does not va'afilu bevika gedola. We mean even in a humongous plain. Meaning the point is that we say again, remember that the ratio of becoming problematic is 7.5, 7.5 carbon for a base core. And so if in fact I sell you instead of 30 carbon worth of land, I sell you 38 carbon worth of land. Well, then according to the Tanakama in our Mishnah, the overage is under 9, and so as a result, I get to decide that you are purchasing the extra carbon, that extra 8 carbon that I gave you. However, if the field that I sell you is 30 cob and I sell you not 9 carbon extra, now all of a sudden I can't force you to purchase it, but I instead you have the right to return the land to me. Now, what happens if instead of 1 base core, I sell you 2 base core, and the amount that I sell extra is 10 kav? So I sold you 10 extra kav in the 2 base core. Now, from a ratio perspective, and actually, you know what? Instead of from a ratio perspective, it's less than 7.5. So actually, that's a bad example. So instead of selling you, instead of selling you again, so I sell you 2 base core, which is 60 kav worth of land, and I sell you, instead of 15 extra, I sell you 16 extra. So now that I sold you 16 extra, that's greater than the 4% ratio. And so now, according to the math, you have to either pay me extra or you have to give me back the land, and I get to decide, was the way we understood it. So, but Rav Huna says, no, I don't get to decide in this situation because the aggregate amount that I oversold you was a total of 16 kav. 16 kav, of course, is greater than 9 kav. And so as a result, you have the right to return that 16 kav to me directly. Because even though I sold you a much larger piece of property, we're not going to focus on the proportion, but rather on the raw amount. The Rav Nachman Amar, Rav Nachman says, no sein shivas kabin umachza l'chol kor v'kor. You need to have the ratio of 7.5 kavs for every core. And so as a result, even in a sale involving much more than that, I still can only give you only a little bit extra. And if I give you a lot extra, then you're going to be able to return it to me. Okay. And so now we turn to the Kuf Dalet bet, one of the most interesting looking dapim in the daf. V'ika milsi yisera l'sisha kabin. And if there's anything more than a quarter kav of over measure per saw, well then it's got to be between and up to 9 kavs per saw. Well then hadre. Then only then it is going to be the excess land is going to be returned. So Esvei Rav Nachman. So now we're going to ask Rav Nachman because Rav Nachman was the second opinion that seemed to suggest that it's based on a ratio for every saw and not a raw number, because our Mishnah, we said that if there was 9 kabin extra in the field that I gave you, well then lav dezabin like kurayim. Isn't this rule talking about even when I sold you 2 cores of land? And so as a result, 9 kav gets returned and you, the buyer, get to make that decision. I can't force you to keep it, even though I sold you 2 kavs of land. You get to return it to me. No, it's not necessarily dezabin leikor. When the Mishnah says that the 9 kavs are the extra, that's where the sale was only 1 core. And so therefore, according to Rav Nachman, you don't have the right to decide to give me back the land. The only time you'll have the right to give me back the land is if the ratio is such that it's more than 9 calves per saw that I gave you. I'm
It
sorry,
is more than
more than
9.
9 kavs per core that I gave you, or more than a quarter kav per saw.
But this is 9 kav, isn't it?
Yes, but I sold you 2 core. So again, if the ratio, so we have the machlokus between Rav Nachman and Rav Huna is the following. I sell you 2 core of land, and I gave you an extra 16 kav. And so now, according to Rav Huna, the extra amount is more than 9 kav. So as a result, you get to return it to me. And you can decide as the purchaser that you don't want to buy that extra land. However, when it comes to Rav Nachman says we focus on the ratio. And here, the ratio is more than 7.5 kavin per core, but less than 9 kavin per core. And so as a result, I have the right to tell you that you need to pay me for that difference, and you need to buy that extra. And so as a result, that's the machlokus that we have between Rav Nachman and Rav Huna.
Well, whose statement is this? The top line.
That is part of Rav Nachman's view, that if there's anything more than the quarter kav, and it's enough to bring the total to over 9 kav, well, now that's when you get to return the land to me. That's when I no longer have the ability to force you to purchase it. However, if the overage is between 7.5 and 9, so for example, it's 8 kav per saw, well, now all of a sudden, even though I sold you 2 saw, so the total overage is 16 kav, even though I still will have the right, according to Rav Nachman, to force you to make that purchase. Okay?
That's the buyer. I'm saying the seller has the right to force.
Correct. I am the seller in the examples today.
And the seller chooses which manner.
Correct. I get to choose which manner to get back. Now, of course, again, according to Rav Huna,
that's Rav Nachman.
We don't look at we ignore the proportion once we get over 9 kav, and we just say it's more than 9 kav. You as the buyer, if you have to return it to me, you have the right to return the land to me and don't have to purchase the extra.
But you could choose to purchase it. It's a choice. The buyer is the choice, right?
No, the buyer has the right to force the seller to take back the land.
Right.
But he does not have the right to force the seller to sell the land. Meaning if the seller wants to get back the land, then he would have the right to take back the land as well. Okay, so it's not quite the same thing as giving the buyer the choice, because the buyer can't force the seller to sell the land unless the seller wants to, the extra land. Right? So again, I sell 2 core to you. I have 16 extra kav in that 2 core. And now we're now holding like Rav Huna. And so as a result, I cannot force you to buy it. But now, let's say you do want to buy it. I still have the right to say, no, I want my land back, because it's enough land, because I still have that right. The seller always has the right to take back the overage, the mistaken overage, back in land. And so as a result, the buyer does not have the right to force the sale. Okay.
Well, what we learned earlier that there is a case where the buyer can force, right? What's the case where just above earlier there was a case where the buyer has rights. The buyer can force.
The buyer's rights are not about forcing the seller to sell, but rather that the price is determined based on the lower of the current market price and the original sale price. That's the right that the buyer has. And but that does not mean that the buyer can force the seller to sell.
Right. Okay. So it has to do with the price, right?
Exactly, exactly. Okay, uvagina beit chatzikav. And again, our Mishnah noted that when it came to a garden, so then the area, the relevant area was a half cup, because again, that's would be roughly the 4% that we have for the overall ratio when it comes to a core. Lav de zabin le satayim. So now, again, doesn't this also undermine Rav Nachman's view? Meaning, even isn't this rule true even if I were to sell you 2 saw of garden space? No, again, lo, saw. It's only the rule of the Mishnah is only where there's 1 saw that was sold. Ukadivrei Rabbi Akiva. Well, 1 second. What about the words of Rabbi Akiva? Beis Rova, my lav dezabin le saw. 1 second. Isn't he referring to a situation where there was 1 saw that was sold, in which case an overmeasure of a quarter kav belongs to the buyer in Rav Nachman's view? Yet the Mishnah rules that according to Rabbi Akiva, an overmeasure of this amount gets returned to the seller. So again, this seems to refute Rav Nachman's view. Lo, dezabin le chatzi saw. That again, we were dealing with a situation where it was a chatzi saw garden, and so as a result, again, it's more than a quarter kav, and so as a result, it's more than the amount that the buyer is allowed to keep. And so even Rav Nachman would agree that the land must be returned. So now the Gemara asks, Boy Rav Ashi, Sadeh v'nases gina. What happens if, and Rashbam explains this, that the nature of the land changed? That the difference between, what's the difference between a field and a garden? So the Rashbam explains that we can
This is I'm sorry, before we got this sounds like a new topic somewhat, but
yes, it's a somewhat new topic.
But just before we do that, when we're saying that he can return the land, we said much earlier that maybe the seller doesn't want the land. If it's too small, he can't even use it.
Correct. And that's why what we're dealing with in these situations is always where the minimum amount of land for that type of usage is being dealt with. And so as a result, that's why you need to have at least 9 kav for a field, at least a chatzi kav for a garden. And so that's why you need to have those ratios, that those sizes, in order for it to work out. And only then, and that would be sufficient to be worthwhile to keep the amount. And so as a result, that's the basis to say that the seller the buyer has the right to return, because the amount that's being returned is a good amount for the purpose of the field. And that's a great transition now to Rav Ashi's question, because Rav Ashi's question is, what happens if the nature of the field changed? And Rashbam explains, if we take a look at the Rashbam, V'na'asis Gina, it's 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, about 18 lines down towards the end of the line. Biyad alokeach. According to the Rashbam, the nature of the field has changed while it's in the hands of the buyer, but kodem shehichzir lo mos below lakarka. But before, the buyer has an obligation to return the overage, but the overage, he has not yet returned either money or land. And gadol nahar lakan, and now a river has grown so that it now covers this land, because the difference between a garden and a regular field is that a garden has ready access to water. Oh, noveya ma'ayan, or there was revealed a spring, lakan, over here. Dahavale rovi lagina. So now all of a sudden it is fit for growing various kinds of vegetables. That, as we saw in Perek Yud Aleph Pasuk Yud in Dvarim, I think it's at the end of Parshas Ekev, that the amount that when it comes to describing Eretz Mitzrayim, it says that it's that the Mitzrayim can be watered with your foot, meaning that it's just easy to undo a dam or undo a spring, and then all of a sudden your herbs are growing. And so as a result, that's the situation that you've now changed. So do we say that because the amount of the overage is a good garden, therefore you get to return the garden, you get to return the land? Or do we say that because when you bought it originally, it was a field and the amount that was extra was not large enough to be a good field, do we say that you cannot return the field? So what's the halacha? Teku. In the end, we say that we're unsure, it remains unresolved. And similarly, we're going to have other questions. So Tana, imhaya samach l'sadehu afilu kol shehu. We said a new rule that if the field that I sold to you was next to one of my other fields, well then, when you return extra land to me, afilu kol shehu, you can machzer, even if I go over by a little bit amount, even if I said, let's say I was selling you a precise amount. So you have to now return to me a very, very small amount of property, machzer lo karka. You have the right to return that to me in actual land that is adjacent to my field, because now it is that land. We no longer say that land won't be good for me for anything, because it's still good because it's adjacent to my other lands. So by Rav Ashi asked the question on that situation, Bor Mahu Shetafsik. What if there's a pit between the land that you're returning to me and my other lands? Or Amasamayim Mahu Shetafsik. Or if there's an irrigation canal, what do we say? Do we say that that's enough to separate? Derek harabim mahu shetafsik. All right, it's not my field, and it's a public path. And so do we say that the public path is sufficient? Because after all, the public path is flat, so I can relatively easily grow stuff on the additional land that you give me. Is that okay? Richba dedikla mahu shetafsik. Or what about if there's a hedge of palm trees that are between them? So maybe I should go between them, or deal with them in some other way, go around them. So in all of those situations, is that enough of a separation that now we won't allow you to return my land? And teku. The end result is we don't have a good answer, and the questions all stand. Okay, below es finally, though we mentioned in our Mishnah, below es harova bilbad machzer lo, he doesn't just return the quarter kav ela kol moser. You return everything extra. Now that's a little bit of a odd wording. Klape laya, to what is this referring? Meaning that the logic suggests the exact opposite. That the buyer, you would think that the buyer should give the extra beyond the quarter kav, more likely than the quarter kav itself. And of course, that's how we're going to reread it. Tane Ravin bar Rav Anachman, lo es hamoser bilvad machzer lo, ella es kol haravain kulan. But you don't just return the extra, meaning that if I transfer to you a quarter kav per sa, or 7.5 kav extra for the core of land that I gave you. So let's say I gave you 8 extra kav for the core of land. So it's not just the 1/2 extra kav, because if I had given you 7.5 kav, and let's say that I sold it to you and I said I'm giving you to a core more or less. So if I had given you a core plus 7.5 kav, then it would have been a totally valid transaction, and you'd be able to keep all 37.5 kav worth of land. But now that instead of giving you 37.5 kav of land, I gave you 38 kav of land. And so as a result, there's that only a half extra. One might have thought that all you have to return to me is that 1/2 of a kav extra. The answer is no, you have to return all 8 kav extra that I gave you. And that, in fact, is again similar to what we've seen previously, that when there's when the mistake is sufficiently large, we don't just return the overage, we return the entire amount. Again, it's in some ways it's similar to the laws of Ona, where if I charge you 10% extra, well, then I get to keep the 10%. But if I charge you exactly 1/6 extra, well, then now all of a sudden it's a valid transaction, but I have to give back to you that full 6. Even though if I had sold it for 1 penny less, I wouldn't have had to give you back anything. So even though I might argue, well, I should only have to give you back the 1 extra penny. The answer is no. Once I reach whatever threshold, I have to give you back the entire amount. So we will pick up, God willing.
Well, what was sorry, earlier we were discussing 7.5 and 9, right? What happens in that intervening place again between 7.5 and 9?
No. Good question, and that will help me clarify, and that's an important clarification. So if so 7.5 is the amount that if I'm less than that, you get to keep the whole thing. And if I shorted you by that less than that amount, then I get to keep the whole purchase price. But if the difference is 7.5 up to whatever, well, then we have to undo it. Whatever, if it's 7.5 is the threshold for undoing the extra part of our transaction. Now, how do we undo it? That's the question where 9 kav comes in. If, in fact, the amount of extra is more than 9 kav, well, now, all of a sudden, you can return the land to me. I can't force you to buy it. However, when it was between 7.5 and 9, I could force you to buy it.
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day. Looking forward to picking up, God willing, tomorrow with the Mishnah at the bottom of Kuf Daled Amud Bet.
A good day.